All right, today I want to talk about Chapter 5, and I'm not going to have time to talk about everything in Chapter 5. And I think I will talk primarily about this stuff at the beginning, where I talk about the idea of society being a computation and society having a hive mind, and the four classes of computation you see in human relationships. And there's some stuff at the end I want to talk about the unpredictability of the economy, and some stuff about maybe also a little bit about aesthetics. There's a little bit I want to say. There's a lot of stuff in the middle of the chapter about power laws, and I think I probably won't have time to lecture on that. And as I was saying right when we came in, it's sort of, in a way, the power law stuff doesn't have that much to do with the theme of the book. It's just something I've always wondered about power laws, and I've never seen a good explanation of them, and I just wanted to kind of nail them. And again, as a writer, I get interested in power laws because it sort of explains, why I don't make as much money as Stephen King, and why that should be okay. And it has to be okay. Now I'm just trying to get the projector to work. Let's see, what do I have to do here? I've forgotten how to do this. Oh yeah, push this button. That might do it. Let's try this. There we go. Okay, so I thought just to do a few demos right at the start here. And let's see, can I borrow your book? Thanks, Greg. And I want to start with some of the birds demos. We did those before. I think I've showed them to you before, but it'd be worthwhile just to look at them again for a minute, because this is a good example of a class 4 computation that happens when we get multiple systems interacting. And let's see, where do I have this? This is something that was invented quite a while ago by a guy called Craig Reynolds. He works for Sony now. And let's see, I'm just looking for where the birds demo is. I guess, well, I guess it's down in the science directory. Okay, so let's see, science. So I'm going to start up the Boppers program, and so I want to find boppers.exe in here. Here it is. And let's make it nice and big. And as we've discussed this a little bit before, this is this artificial life program I wrote at Autodesk, and then actually ended up, I got laid off and they let me keep the code, and I released this as an independent product from a company in Corte Madera. They were sort of sleazebags, in that they didn't pay me most of my royalties. Let's see. So I'm looking for the...
So at what point did you get to start having the code yourself, or you just posting it online?
Huh?
Like the other company, like if they have it, when do you get to just have it put on your website?
Oh, well, I had to get a paper from their lawyer, because they had been paying me, a lot. They were paying me $90,000 a year for a while. That was the best I ever had. Those were the days. This is at Autodesk, yeah. It was for a while. It was just really crazy there. It was the early '90s, and they had more money than they knew what to do with. And it was even before the internet got big. And they were like, let's hire these people to do really cool things. And so they had some guys working on virtual reality. They called it the Cyberspace Project. And then I did the Cellular Automata Project. And we did James Glick's Chaos. We did that software. And then I was doing this artificial life software. And then Autodesk stock went down, and they noticed that these things we were doing had nothing at all to do with their core business, which is helping architects build buildings or helping industrial designers design like turbines, dishwashers. I mean, I would argue with them. I would try to make a case. Well, you should really have the cellular automata. We could model the heat flowing through the engine using this. And they're like, yeah, that's fine. But then they laid off me and most of the guys I was working with. So they didn't want to market this software because they hadn't made that much money on the Chaos software. It sold pretty well. It sold about 50,000 copies. But they didn't make any money because it was because they pissed it away on the documentation. They got the documentation group involved before the software was done. And so they had like 5 people who were getting, their salary. And all they were doing was screwing around writing the user guide for our program, which wasn't done. So just the clock was running. And they bill that in terms of the company. So by the time we shipped the product, we had this huge, at least, debt in the ledgers. So it looked as if the product was not successful. Though in a way, it did pretty well. And but that was really fun working there. Anyway, I'm trying to load an experiment file, and why am I not finding my experiment files? Let's try again. File, open. Maybe it's params that I want to open. Yeah, that's it. Okay, so params. I think gnats is a good example of the birds. Okay. No, that's not a good example. I think fat birds is a good one. Okay, so let's open. So I'm opening params. I'm opening fatbirds.bl. There we go. Okay. I love these things. So we've got 3 flocks here. There's a red, green, and a blue flock. And by now I think we've seen enough simulations that it's pretty easy to see that that's class 4. Okay? It's not random seething, not class 3. Okay? It's obviously not periodic. It's not dying out. It's class 4. Now, what we could do to sort of simplify what's going on here, we could go to say, instead of having 3 flocks, let's just have one kind of bird. Let's just have a bunch of green ones and get rid of the reds and blues. And another thing we might do is let's put the walls on the world so they can't go off the edge. And now you can see them flocking around here. And there's a sort of behavior that you see, which is that they bunch up, but then they'll break into separate groups. So that's the sort of computational aspect that it's, in a way, it's a little like gliders that we keep having. Let's have as many as we can here. How high can it go? 27, okay. So now we've got 27 of them here. And so they form these clusters, and then they go off. They keep grouping. They have individuals move from one cluster to another. Now, what is the rule? Well, Craig Reynolds, as I've mentioned before, but let's just recap it one more time. There's three principles for these flocking programs. The birds try to adjust their speed, so if they're about to ram into another one, they slow down. If there's another one about to hit them, they speed up. They try to fly parallel to their nearest neighbors. Actually, what we do here is you look at your 2 closest neighbors, average their direction, and try to go in that direction. And then another thing is you also take it figure out where the center of the flock is, and you head towards the center of the flock. Now, as I mentioned in the book, when you actually write these simulations, you find out there's a lot of little decisions you can make. It turns out it's better not to just use the whole average of the flock. It's better to do a weighted average and pay more attention to the guys that are near you. But anyway, you get these emergent things. You find them doing these sort of DNA strands, these double helix things. And now the point here is this is like a real simple toy example of society. Like one of the simplest things that people do. If you go to the mall and look at people walking around, they avoid running into each other. And they do these sorts of flocking behaviors. And I think for a while this is all the demo I'm going to need. So I'm going to turn this off. I'd like to pull the plug out, but Ephraim says I shouldn't do that. Okay. All right, I'll give the fan a minute to calm down. So that's one of the things when you look at people moving in crowds, we're very sensitive to each other's motions. You don't want to bump into people. You tend to move a little bit parallel. Now, normally the thing of heading towards the middle of the flock, that's something you would only do if you feel threatened. Okay, often there's other drives that you might have. If you're trying to get into a concert, you're trying to push towards the front, or if you're trying to escape somewhere. And we see people's motions doing these kinds of things. Now, another thing that people do together, rather than physically move, is that they talk to each other. And that's something that's interesting to think about. I find the 4 classes of computation, it's sort of useful to think about them in terms of conversation. Because, like I would say, a class 1 conversation is if you have somebody that always goes back to the same topic, everything always leads back. Like something I think I've mentioned before, some people my age, whatever you talk to them about, then they always bring it back to, something about the government that they're angry about. Or I have another friend, he's always talking about the environment. And that's interesting and it's important, but it's like a fixed point, a tractor. It's like wherever I start out talking to this guy, we always end up, at the same point. Isn't it awful that, whatever. And so that's, so it's not, although I love him, it's not very interesting to have a conversation with him, because I know we're always going to get drawn into that point attractor. Now, another kind of conversation is class 2, where you sort of go around and around in a circle. And often we do this with people that we're in relationships with, like a wife, or a parent. There's like you have the same argument over and over again, and then it sort of never resolves itself. There's this Scottish psychologist, R.D. Laing, and I quoted a couple. He did this little book called Knots, about these little loops that people get themselves into. Like, I'm guilty, that you're guilty, that I'm guilty, that you're guilty, that I'm guilty, Or I'm angry, that you're angry, that I'm angry, that you're angry. And you can get into these lacerating kinds of loops. And then again, the class 3 conversation is, that's more like your more typical, enjoyable kind of conversation, where you don't really know where it's going, and people are just throwing in things, and it's sort of evolving in all sorts of directions. And that's sort of the type of conversation that's more pleasant to have. And then class 4 would be somewhat more purposeful. And here we're thinking about where you're actually, it's like you're having this, every now and then you'll have some intense conversation with somebody about some topic of mutual interest to you, and you'll feel like as you're talking, your scales are falling from your eyes. You're saying things you didn't know that you knew, and they're saying things that surprise you, and you're just it's really growing. This sort of like the Plato's dialogues are the classic example of that, and that's I would say that's really what we think of as a class 4 conversation, and where it's more focused rather than drifting all over the place. So those are two kinds of initial ideas in there. Now, another idea I have so this is all stuff that comes out of the first section, the hive mind. Let's talk about the hive mind. There's this idea, if society, can we view it as having a mind as a whole? And if we go back and look at, in chapter 4, I talked about these ideas of Antonio Damasio, that consciousness consists of having immersion, like you're immersed in the world. You can distinguish objects. You have a movie in the brain. You have a sort of an image of what's going on. You have a proto-self, that is to say, an image of yourself. You have feelings. You're assigning weights to things that happen to the proto-self. And the core consciousness is the ongoing process of forming feelings about how events affect the proto-self. And it seems like society has all of these things. Clearly society is immersed and it sees objects. Society distinguishes, among cars and buildings. There's numbers for them. It has IDs. Now the movie in the brain, this is where it gets. It's a little bit different. The thing that's a little hard to grasp is that society's hive mind, it isn't like a person's mind. Sometimes you'll see. Once I saw a swarm of bees. It was like this giant slug. There must have been 100,000 of them, just a big glob of them, sort of oozing along. They're like looking for a new hive, and that was a hive being. And the thing that I noticed was it didn't look at all like a bee. Okay, it looked like a giant slug. And so we need to keep in mind that the hive mind of society is not, in some ways, not going to be like the mind of a person. Now, one thing is that we'll find is that the hive mind is it's multiversal. That is to say, it's capable of having very different beliefs at the same time. Which that's one of the reasons that society has a lot of issues. It doesn't agree on something. But before we get into that, what would the movie in the brain be? Well, I think what you see in the media is sort of society's movie in the brain. It's what society is telling itself is what is happening. And this is where you just want to weep sometimes. It's so frustrating to see the media focus on really stupid ways of looking at the world. Like, I still am waiting. Well, it seems like there should have been an apology from the media for the Y2K frenzy. We could have enjoyed like the year 2000 rolling around. That's a big deal. And they just whipped up. They got scammed, by these guys, and just whipped up all this terror and fear, and wouldn't really dodge. It was like a total, like a crazy person. They just won't deal with facing the wonder of reaching the year 2000. I can't think about that. I'm too busy fixing my computer. And of course, even in Uganda, none of the computers broke, Nothing happened. Does the media then say we were wrong? No. What's the next thing to get frantic about? And just on and on. And but we're kind of stuck with it. That's the movie in the brain of society. Now, there are smaller sub-hives within society. Like if you spend a lot of time on the web, there might be certain news sites that have the kind of news that you're interested in, or blogs of people you like describing things. So there's always different groups you can be in. But you could say that, at least at the coarsest scale, what's in the mass media is sort of society's, that's kind of society's hive mind. It's what society thinks is going on. And society, within that movie in the brain, within that representation of what society thinks is going on, there's images of, America is a pitiful, helpless giant, or we're a cruel fascist state, or we're beleaguered, or, whatever they're saying that we are that day. There's this image of the country, and there's feelings that they have about the self, this sort of image of the country, and feelings that you have about it. And these are all being things that are, in some sense, it's sort of weird how these ideas are somewhat generated, and it's not like there's some room where like 2 or 3 guys decide what's going to be in the newspapers. I mean, sometimes you'll find people who, are deeply paranoid, who feel like that's how it works, but somehow it isn't really like that. It's more that these things just sort of emerge, and it's driven by whatever people are most interested in, what they watch, what sells newspapers. It's a somewhat mysterious process, but that is to some extent the hive mind. And you could say, in a sense, society is conscious in Damasia's way of putting it, because it's continually forming feelings or opinions about the little group of events that it focuses on and how these events affect the proto-self. So it's sort of nice to read the paper because it's, you feel like you're plugged into that hive mind. But as I was saying earlier, there are times, sometimes you just get such a disgust with what you see in the newspaper. It's so much not, what you would want society to be thinking about. And there are smaller hives that you can get involved in. But again, one of the things that I guess that makes the hive mind sometimes not so nice to be a part of, at least in the media sense, is that it often does not seem to be engaging in a class 4 computation. It becomes obsessed with certain topics, like the sexuality of children. That's something that, like in the 70s, the media became obsessed with that. They're always talking, there are all these like trials about like nursery school abusers, which actually weren't happening, but there was just like this obsession. Becomes obsessed with these certain things. Then there's the back and forth, where we just have the tit for tat things going on. And they're always saying, well, we need a meaningful dialogue. And that we want to see something class 4, but it's not so often that we see that. But one thing that I also came to realize is I could stop reading the paper entirely, and I'm still part of society. The kind of important stuff about society, it isn't so much this show that you see in the newspapers. It's the fact that you can buy food, and you have a house, and you have a language. In other words, the computation that society is doing that's really the kind of the most interesting is producing this huge physical hive that we live in. In other words, that's the thing. That's what society does that's really good. I mean, forget about whether or not you like who's in the White House. I've got a car. I can buy gas. I can come here. We can arrange to meet here in this room at a certain time, and we all know to show up here, which is kind of amazing. And then, I can talk to you guys, and I actually get paid to do this. I mean, this is a good deal. I mean, society does some things nice. And so language and culture and technology, they're the sort of honey in the hive. They're the nice things that society does. And I'll say a little more about language in a minute. One more thing I want to mention relating to hive. There's always this persistent feeling that when we look at the internet, in some ways it seems so much like like a neural network. In other words, we've got the computers, they're nodes, they're kind of like neurons, and they're all linked to each other, and they're all communicating with each other. And so there's this feeling sometimes that maybe someday the internet might wake up. You know, sometimes this super mind might emerge in the internet. And could that happen? Well, it could, but the thing is, we sort of control pretty much closely what our computers are doing. We don't let them really work together that strongly. And the internet itself, you don't really have... I mean, what's going on in the real world, where we have newspapers, you know, we're building buildings, it's really so much richer than what's going on inside the internet. Because within the internet, there really isn't what you could think of as a movie in the brain. The internet doesn't have sort of some clear image of what's going on. Unless you might say, maybe it's the DNS server that knows where all the IP addresses are, or where it figures out how to do the routing. But these aren't things that are really interesting. In some sense, the internet it's not immersed in the physical world in so much the same way that we human beings are. It's a little more abstract. But still, there's this fantasy that maybe someday the internet would wake up. Sometimes in Hollywood movies, when the internet wakes up, then, you know, it says, well, now you humans will be my slaves. And I always have to laugh at that, because we're already the slaves of the computers. I mean, I think I've mentioned this before. There's nothing more we could do for computers than we're already doing. I mean, what more could we possibly do for them? We're always talking about them. We're building them. You know, we're designing better ones. If you have a computer, you spend a great deal of your time caring for it, you know, fixing it, downloading patches. I mean, there's no... So the idea of the computer saying, now I will rule, there's nothing more they could get. Okay, so if they wake up, they're probably, it's more likely they'd be, you know, well, thanks, you've been doing a really nice job, you know. So I don't think we have to be too afraid of them. I have some things about language, because language is sort of that's one of the more interesting social computations that we have. A couple of points to make. I found a nice way of describing telepathy that I think is kind of cool. Suppose your computer does this computation to generate some complicated fractal, like the Mandelbrot set. There's three ways. The three ways the computer could show you that image. It could just, there's a sort of language-like method, and it could simply tell you the algorithm that it used, and say, okay, here are the tools for making this image. Here's the algorithm. Here are the parameters I used. You take those, and then you can create the image in your own head. And that's sort of how language works, because we don't actually. If I wanted, I could describe some party I went to, some lavish Playboy Mansion type scene, people dancing on the tables, giant gold bowls full of champagne. I go on, and you're building this picture in your mind, but all I'm doing is really giving you a kit to make the picture. I'm giving you words, and you're building it. Now, another way to go about would be to, suppose I took some photographs, and that's another way of doing it. You could say, let's pass you a visual representation. I could give you, or in terms of the computer and the Mandelbrot set, it could send you a JPEG of the image that it had. So rather than giving you the tools for building the image, it can just give you the image. In actual language, we don't really do that in spoken language in any case. It doesn't really lend itself to that. In spoken language, you're pretty much limited to giving somebody the kit. But we do, we use gestures, sometimes that's an easier way to describe something than to just use the words, a shape you can mold in the air. Now, a third thing that you can do with computers that at this point people can't do, but it'd be cool if we could, computer could say, look, you want to see the Mandelbrot set that I just made? Here's a link. And it just says, you just click this link, you'll actually go to this spot on the computer and you'll view, maybe without even without even downloading it, you could just access that data and get it directly. And that would be, when I was working at Autodesk in those years I was talking about before, there was this guy called Ted Nelson. And he was a very early computer visionary. And he had this idea for a product called Xanadu. And he had the idea that there should be only one copy of any piece of information on the internet. Because he said then everybody can always just link to the same piece, to that same representation of the information. Like a lot of times you might have noticed, if, like the other day, there's a certain Zen koan I was interested in involving a short staff. And it's where some guy holds up a stick and says, our staff, he says, what is this? He says, if you call it a stick, you're limiting it. But if you say it's not a stick, you're denying reality. And so what do you say? And so I searched for that on Google, and I found, maybe 50 different sites, and everybody has the exact same text. So they copy the text, they move it to their site, and they put it there. So you might have found that. Sometimes you'll say, oh, I got all these hits, there's so much information, and you found out every single person has just cut and paste the same exact thing. So it would have been cool, and it's too late to do it now, but Ted Nelson, he has some really great ideas that didn't all work out. But it would be cool if there's just one version. If the guy that wrote something sort of got to have the only version that was on the web, and everybody, it would just rapidly always fetch that from where he kept it. And that would be nice also, because then, he could revise it, or she could revise it, and then it would always be up to date. The reason that he especially thought this was good was then you could set, in effect, micropayments. So, if I wrote something that people liked, and if the only way to read it was to get it off my site, if for some reason it was impossible to actually copy it and post it somewhere else, then there'd be a way to, register the hits and to have a little meter running. But that's not the way it worked out. Another thing Ted Nelson was very interested in was reverse links. He thought it was really important for any page to be able to find all the pages that link to that page. Google can do that.
That's essentially what they do. That's how they
You
search out
type something in now, it's like you type like link colon or something like that, and it lists about all the pages that link to this.
Right, there's some way to access that information.
Maybe that's how they build it.
Sure. Right. They get their page rank by saying, if just lamers link to this page, it's not so good, but if there's lots of links and these guys have high page rank, then... There's this young science fiction writer called Cory Doctorow. He wrote a book called Down and Out in the Magic Kingdom. It's about Disney World in Florida. I don't know why. He's kind of obsessed with Disney World in Florida. He's Canadian. But it's kind of a neat book. And he has this word in there he calls it wuffie. W-H-U-F-F-I-E. And it's like everybody in the world has a wuffie, which is essentially their page rank, or how much credibility they have. And you can see it because everybody has this sort of heads-up display built into their, contact lenses that they're wearing or something. So you look at somebody, you can see a sort of bar on their head. This person has really high wuffie, so whatever they say is going to be worth listening to. And then you can pass it on. Like if somebody with high page rank links to you, well, that's what getting blurbs from famous people on your book is about, to try to get some wuffie off them. But anyway, so there's three ways we could do language. Language is a toolkit, or you could do a representational image, or you could do the telepathic link. Will we ever be able to get into telepathy? Well, it's a matter of degree. It's the kind of word telepathy is kind of wrapped in all this sort of history of pseudoscience and debate. But in principle, it seems, I mean, if you'd never seen a telephone, and you suddenly saw two people with cell phones, you'd feel like, they've got telepathy. I mean, he's over here, she's over there. They're talking to each other. So it's sort of a matter of degree. But then you say, oh, it's a little machine and they have to talk. So there's a sense that maybe for it to really be telepathy, you shouldn't have to talk out loud. So then again, that doesn't seem insuperable, though, because you can think words without actually saying them. And I think there's even a way to get a subvocal microphone where you can actually barely be thinking words. And I think a microphone can pick them up in your chest. Or maybe there'd be a way to... In my science fiction books, I always have this device called an UVY, UVVY. It's this little soft piece of smart plastic that people wear on the back of their neck. And in some versions, I have it sinking hair-fine tendrils into your neck and probing into your spinal cord. But it's hard to sell a product that does that. So nowadays I say, well, instead it's got magnetic field vortices that reach in like an MRI scan or something, and that's a little more palatable. People don't like the hair-fine tendrils sinking into their spinal cord. That's not something they want. But
people under 30 might go for it.
In where?
I say people under 30 might go for it.
Oh yeah, people under 30 might go for it. Yeah.
Anyone who's had a spinal tap on the other hand.
Spinal tap. But if there was something like that, I mean, if you got so you could have this sort of cell phone conversation without talking out loud, it'd be sort of close to telepathy. But still, you'd probably still be exchanging language. Could you ever link actually into another person's brain and feel their thoughts? That's not so clear. That would be harder to do. That would be harder to do. Though maybe there would be some way to do that too, to somehow tap in directly to their deepest sensations. A two-way.
You'd be able to map both people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, it could happen, but not really soon. Now, another thing about language that's worth noticing is that this is something that Emil Post proved. If you take even simple rules for language, there's actually there's no way to exhaustively list. There's no way to predict in advance whether or not somebody might possibly say something. There's this sort of what they call grammar generation rules, and we can get into ways to generate sentences that somebody might possibly say, and you could over time list all the sentences that some device might be able to utter, but it could take forever to find out if a given sentence was going to be said or not. So that's a point I get into, but I don't think I'll delve into that any deeper than that. Okay, now at this point I get into the power law stuff, and like I say, I think I'm just going to zap over that. I don't feel like dealing with explaining it. It's what?
Spilled milk.
Spilled milk. Yeah. Yeah, it's really just, I was just bracing myself for not selling 100,000 copies of this book. Sort of getting ready for that by analyzing it. There are some interesting rules, though. I guess there's one rule, as long as I've got the projector here. There's one demo I probably should show you. There's a couple of nice demos. I ought to show you the sand pile rule, and maybe the forest fire rule, and the maybe the Zeldovich city rule. Let's see if this thing comes back up. Okay. So as I mentioned, most things in society, pretty much all of them, get distributed according to power laws. And that means a typical power law has the form the number of people at level L is typically going to be some constant over L raised to some small number, like maybe 1 or 2 or 3. Okay, so it's typically, if you do a graph where this is the L, and then this would be like getting a lot of L, this would be not much L. And typically we have these curves that look like this, okay? And they're called power law because it's 1 over something raised to a power. In a way, power law is a little bit, I think they should really call them inverse power laws. But most things in society tend to be distributed this way. It's the old thing, like 1% of the people get 90% of the money. 10% of the people get the rest of it, and everybody else gets 10 cents. So it's and it always seems sort of evil, but it just turns out, for various reasons I try to analyze in this chapter, it seems to be something that's kind of inevitable in societies. It's not capitalism, it's not communism, it's just the way that nature works.
The upper right-hand corner always is like is favorable for like see right there? Like a single bird will always wiggle around right there.
Okay, we're looking at the bird simulation. It seems like the bird likes to get stuck in the upper right-hand corner.
Yeah, not in the other corners.
If that's really true, that would mean there was a bug in the program, right?
We'll just have it again, see?
Well, not necessarily.
Well, okay.
Well, because it should be symmetric. I mean, there shouldn't be anything different one corner from the other.
Why?
Well, I mean, what would be different? It's symmetric. I mean, everything's supposed to be the same. But it does sort of look like they like that corner. Well, you can figure that out for next week.
Plus the other dimensions of space.
Well, no, I mean, if you're doing a simulation and everything's supposed to be the same in every direction, it should be that the same things happen in every corner. But I want to show you a couple of these 2D power law CAs. So let's look at, let's see, 2D, well, I'll show you the fire one first of all. 2D forest fire 9. And let's flip this. So let's go to open the 3D view controls. Oh, and press the flip button. Yeah. So we get a flat image. And what you're seeing here is it's actually a Belousov-Jabotinsky rule. You can see those faint scrolls. This is some geologists came up with this, or geographers, I guess they're called, of saying, let's do a simulation where we're imagining having trees that are occasionally struck by lightning, and if they're struck by lightning, then they burn, and then we have the fire propagating. So that's the white things are the burning cells, and then a tree is not. I think a tree's not ready to burn until it's red. Okay, I think it seems like the white stuff is burning up the red stuff, and then the blue things are the sort of burned out areas. Yeah. So the red trees are continually growing. Lightning is hitting them and causing forest fires. Now, what's the power law aspect here? This would be if, let's see, if you measure the sizes of the forest fires. So for each time that a dot is turned on, you could measure how many red cells actually get burned by that particular thing. And it turns out that will lie in a power law distribution. A nicer or kind of more dramatic, or do you have a question about that? There's another version where they only look at 2 neighbors, 2D forest fire 5. See, this is either they look at 9 neighbors or at 5 neighbors. So again, the power law thing you would measure, I think, would be how long, let's see, what is it that you're measuring for your power law? The size of a cascade. Okay, so a cascade would be like randomly the cells are getting set to white every now and then. And sometimes the sun gets set to white and it dies out right away. And then others of them manage to have a much longer lasting degree of success. And so there will be a few really big ones, a bunch of medium ones, and lots of ones that you hardly even see. They die right away. Actually, another example of a power law cellular automaton. And this would be the Zeldovich. This is kind of a very neat rule. I like this one. The Zeldovich city. Okay. So this is a very nice, simple rule. What we do here is at every update, each cell, so this is supposed to be population, okay? And so I loaded the rule Zeldovich 9, I think. And what we're doing for the update is at every update I'm averaging, each cell is averaging its neighbors. So that corresponds to the idea that people migrate, they move around in their neighborhood. And then what we're doing to drive the thing to sort of be dynamic is at every cell you flip a coin and say, let's say half the time the population will double at this location, and half the time the population at this location will totally die out. So it's this sort of boom or bust. Now if you're in a densely populated area, if like your cell dies out, the thing is at the next averaging step, you're going to get some stuff averaged back into you, so it's okay. It's sort of like if you're in it, like we're in San Jose, they tear down a building, but you come back next year and then the people have spilled back in there. So it's like, it doesn't die out. And this Zeldovich rule looks particularly dramatic if we look at the 3D version, picture of it. So if we go to the sheet version, so it's, so you have a few really big spikes. See, that's Stephen King. That's his sales there. And you have lots of medium ones, and then, even more tiny ones. Now, the Zeldovich rule, I think the parameter that you get is, let's see, it was invented by a physicist for some completely other reason, having nothing to do with cellular automata. One thing that I found in studying the literature, it actually is a nice n equals c over L squared. So it's a precisely L squared, which is kind of interesting. One thing I found in researching, a lot of times scientists will write papers about rules like this, and they won't even mention that it's a cellular automaton. I think, to me, that annoys me, because I love cellular automata, and I want them to get the credit they deserve. But I think some people maybe aren't aware that if you can put continuous valued numbers into a rule, it's still a cellular automaton. And there's also, I don't know. But anyway, certainly this is a cellular automaton. One thing about it, one thing that is still lacking, a research thing that I would like to see someone come up with, the forest fire rule and this rule and the sandpile rule, which maybe I'll show you, they all have a sort of random aspect to them. Because what we're doing in the Zeldovich rule, we're flipping a coin at each cell and deciding whether to cut the value in half or double it. So every cell we average it with its neighbors, and then we also either double it or halve it. Now, again, it's because of the averaging that you don't see just, if you just doubled or halved it, then you just have random fuzz, but the averaging makes these things concentrate together. Now, but the thing is, what's kind of nicer is a rule like Brian's brain, which is completely deterministic, okay? It's, there's no randomness in Brian's brain. That's our good old favorite. Let's just load that up just for fun. So brain.j. And so this is our 2-year-old brain. And one thing I think you might have in brain, though somehow I'm not the kind of person that would carry out this investigation. It's sort of I tend to lose, I'm not that interested in this kind of thing, but it seems like if somebody went to a little bit of trouble, maybe there is a power law here. Maybe there's it seems like there's a few really big sort of glider ships, then there's lots of tiny things. And I think it might be if we looked at a big simulation of Brian's brain, and we measured, then we just froze a picture and we counted the size of each object. So we would say an object, they sort of break up if something's, you could draw a circle around something that's all in the black, then that's one object. You'd say, how many lit cells are in this? There'll be a few, huge ones, lesser of them. So I think we may be getting a power law here too. This, once again, is a fairly good model of things spreading in society. Now, one thing I mentioned, these power laws have to do a lot with how ideas spread in society, how ideas become popular. And Brian's brain is, again, it's sort of a good example of that too. It's like we have people passing the word on to neighbors, okay, but then there's also the element of being refractory. I just bought an album, I don't want to get another new album, I'm not interested, I just went to the movies. You get worn out on something. And but it's kind of a really great rule. Okay, so I said I wasn't going to talk about power laws, but then I did talk about them a little bit. Now, maybe I'll do 10 more minutes. Okay. The flow of history in society is, again, we would imagine if even people walking down a sidewalk is class 4, it's not going to be surprising that something like the stock market is going to be class 4, and even more so is history. That's one of the surprising things do happen. In other words, history never stops. That's something it's soothing too. Well, there's an upside and a downside. Terrible cataclysms do happen, even though you think everything's settled down. Things never stay settled down in human history. Things always get stirred up again. Now, so you never reach a fixed final state, and you also, the periodic thing doesn't hold up either. So it's not like there used to be this sort of idea we have, civilizations rise and decline, and to some extent that's true, but it's never the same thing twice, really. Okay? Civilizations decline in different ways. And it's certainly not completely random. So society is very much a class 4. Okay, let's see the sand pile here. Let me show you this one too. Yeah, this would be the sandpile rule. It sort of settled down. Now, the sandpile rule dies out, but if you add another dot to it, it can, let's see, how can I add a dot to it? I guess I'll go to control generator and maybe add a generator. Oh well, this demo's not going to work. Never mind. Okay. Let's try to load something simple. Oh, never mind. Forget about the sandpile. Okay. I'm not really giving my best lecture ever today. I've been not feeling too good. But we only have 2 more classes. There's today and next time. We're going to have to do the 6th lecture next time, chapter 6. So, what else can I tell you about chapter 5? Well, one thing I think is fun is at the very end, that table where we have the look at all these things that happen in society in terms of being computations. Like radios, while books broadcast digital thoughts, radio broadcasts analog emotion. The hive mind gains power as listeners form real-time virtual crowds. There's a lot of kind of cool things in there. I got a lot of these things from Marshall McLuhan. Cell phones are interesting. They make it easier to have small hive minds. That's something where people, sometimes they call it flash mobs, where people organize and arrange things very rapidly by cell phone. It's a sort of telepathic thing, which is really cool.